the brain is a weird, mysterious thing. And so I think sometimes, like, you just have to try something. And if you don't have like a specific idea, it's being open to a new exposure or a new thing that might eventually spark an idea. But I wouldn't like be mad at myself for not having the right ideas. But I think sometimes people like discount what their ideas might be. Like they're not good enough, they're not advanced enough, they're not like interesting enough to dive into. And I think that does a disservice as well. Like I write down every idea from least good to to best, and figure out how I might be able to apply them.
Hey nerds, Monica here. Welcome to the Data Podcast for Nerds, where we get to talk to amazing professionals and ask them all about how they're using data to solve the world's problems. We're highlighting skills that data professionals use on a daily basis. Plus, we always include some fun bits because we're all nerds here and we love to have fun. So thank you for tuning in, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And as always, folks, happy learning. Today with us, we have Blake Burch. How are you doing today, Blake?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Monica. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on the show. So we start off our episodes by understanding people's origin stories. So if you could please tell us about your background and how you got to where you are today in your career.
Yeah, we can start all the way back from college, where I was originally a music education major. I thought that I was going to be a collegiate professor, and then kind of figured out that I didn't really want to be dealing with like 6th grade through 12th grade all the time in the high school system. So I decided to switch myself to business. And the business degree that I had was in the marketing and entrepreneurial management space. And kind of coming out of that, I ended up working at a marketing agency initially, to where I was managing the paid ad campaigns for OpenTable. They had just acquired a new brand in the UK, and so I had to get super familiar with the new country, their customs, and how people were reserving restaurants there. But the overall day-to-day work was a lot of things that had to be pulled into Excel. It was trying to figure out what terms are people searching for and which ones are irrelevant for what we're showing up for. How are the ads performing, or how are the keywords that we're bidding on performing, and how can we adjust our bids and budgets on a daily basis? And gradually over time, I just got frustrated having to pull something down in Excel, do a bunch of manual work every single time, and then upload it back to some system. And then the next day, repeat the same thing. And it's like, there's got to be a better way. So I started working with the development team there, and I was like, okay, all this data that I'm pulling from like a Google Ads system, is there like a way for me to get this every day and store it somewhere? And that's how I started learning about databases. And so they helped me set up a Redshift database that we could dump our Google Ads data into. And they were like, well, you're going to need to learn SQL. So I taught myself SQL through a site called SQL Zoo, which I don't think it's the best way to learn it now, but it was then. And started figuring out, okay, how do I like run math in the SQL statements to figure out, hey, if it falls into this tier of performance, apply this sort of change. And I kind of built out SQL statements that did that, and then would print out a final like CSV for me. But I still had to go in and upload that manually, and I didn't want to do that. So they're like, well, you're going to need to learn Python so that I could talk directly to like the APIs of the services that we were using. And so I eventually taught myself that, and I started coming up with like more intricate solutions. Like, how could we take our company's inventory data, or our clients' inventory data, and then map it to the advertising campaigns we were running? So if they ran out of something, we could turn that on and off, or we could bid higher or lower based on inventory fluctuation. And as that happened, they were like, wait, we need to do this across all of our clients. And so I ended up being able to run a data team off of that just started with me trying to automate my everyday ad campaign work. And then that moved from doing search ads to doing social ads and display. And eventually we were building out like the data systems and the algorithms that we were using to manage a lot of campaigns for that agency. And so I ended up leading out a data team of maybe like 12 people around that time. And after about like 6 years of doing that in the space, I kind of saw from a lot of companies that they just weren't using their data to its fullest potential. They weren't finding ways to actually drive ROI on the business, to actually like improve automation and systems that they had. And so I kind of worked with the company there at the agency to split out some technology we had into its own independent unit called Shipyard. And so I was the co-founder and CEO there for about 5 years of trying to take this data technology and get it into the hands of other data practitioners, whether they were data scientists or data engineers or anything else like that. So I've had a wide array of experiences, but honestly, a lot of it came from just understanding the industry, understanding the real problem, and figuring out how to use data to solve it. And eventually that led me to selling a data product, but not doing much day-to-day data work along the way.
Yeah. So you quickly got into automation and just trying to make things easier for you so you didn't have to manually do processes over and over again. Is that right?
That is my biggest passion point. I find a lot of data people get stuck in how do I set up the data, how do I clean it, and how do I get it in dashboards? And I'm always like, all right, how can we go beyond that dashboard? What are we going to do with it? Can we just do that thing automatically? And then maybe we can see how it performed over time. But I'm definitely a big proponent of trying to figure out what can you automate, what are the systems that need the right data to fuel some sort of like action to continuously happen on a daily, weekly, hourly basis.
Yeah. I like that you went directly to leveraging Python for your automation versus since you worked a lot in Excel, a lot of people's first experience is like with a VBA script. Or in my case, I think my first experience was like making batch scripts to do things for me.
Yeah. There are some skip things along the way, so I never learned VBA. I will say, like, my biggest regret in my career is spending too much time learning Excel formulas well, to the point that you're writing like 15 to 20 line long statements that nobody can understand, including yourself, when
Mm-hmm.
they're that long. But I did the same thing with like macro recorder scripts and stuff, where I like
Okay.
record myself using the computer and then having it play it back at like 10x speed. Yeah, I did a little bit of that too.
Yeah, that's fair. That absolutely works.
Yeah.
So I have a very random and silly question. Was it a coincidence that you kind of gravitated toward an orchestration tool, being you have a musician background, orchestra, musician? I'm trying to connect dots over here.
Yeah, maybe. Although, like, let's be real, the labels in the tooling space for data, they're always kind of fuzzy, right? Like at the end of the day, I just wanted an automation tool. Call it orchestration, call it data ops, just yeah. But there's a link there, I guess, somewhere. I do have a baton somewhere because I had to go through those classes in college, so we can say that they work together.
Okay, well, we'll say that. I like that. You're right in the buzzwords, though, in that, like, I feel like every other month there's like new buzzwords, and I'm like, oh, what is this? And I'll go down the rabbit hole, and I'm like, oh, okay, so there's nothing new here. They just called it something different.
Yeah.
I think I was watching, I forget what movie I was watching, but they were calling, they made a reference to data mining.
Mm-hmm.
So the old school term,
Yeah.
right? Data mining. I haven't heard that term in so long. There's been lots of buzzwords that came after that one.
We keep making up new terms to try and sell people a solution to the same problem, which is just like using your data for something useful, right?
Absolutely. Yes. So what, I guess, are your favorite data problems to solve with automation?
I think it depends for the type of business that it is. So again, a lot of my experience was doing it in the ad space, and we had to. We worked with a lot of retailers. They'll spend millions of dollars just on Black Friday weekend alone, and I had the privilege to work with like instant gratification data, so I could make a change and then see how that affected things 15 minutes later, and could instantly change some of that stuff. But not everyone has that sort of like privilege there. Sometimes it is just solving like internal processes and making sure that data is able to exchange hands between two different parties at a rapid pace. Sometimes it is just about updating like audiences and targeting profiles on like your sales tools along the way. Sometimes it's potentially like changing the way the product looks for different people, or changing the messaging that they receive within the product based on their event data and how they are interacting with the product and what they're choosing to use versus what they're not using, and what you're ultimately trying to get them to use down the way. So I wouldn't say that I necessarily have any like direct favorites for automation, but I do look at pretty much every problem a business has through the lens of, all right, how could this be automated, and what data would be necessary to get us to a spot that I don't need to have human intervention to make that decision or make that change continuously along the way.
Yeah, so that's a good point in that like there's a lot of things that still do need that human intervention
Mhm.
in some aspect,
Yeah.
but there are certain ways that you can kind of carve out those processes to be able to automate that. So, can you explain kind of a process that would be difficult kind of to automate because of that human interaction?
Oh man. One of the biggest ones that I have not cracked into yet, just because I'm not as aware of the space. Anything with like logistics and operations, I think those are usually things that have to have a lot more like human intervention, because you're dealing with a lot of individual suppliers. Like imagining you're a grocery store or something else like that, dealing with all the different suppliers of all the different items going on there. You can't really automate all those systems. You do have to have kind of a go between. There will also be things for like the AI space. I think generative AI is great, but a lot of it is like dealing with a junior employee, and you got to review it if you want to make sure that it is accurate or that it represents your brand successfully. You could just throw it out there into the world, but I think a lot of people are coming around to the fact that a lot of that output needs to be checked by someone just to make sure that it is doing the right thing, saying the right thing before it kind of goes out into the wild. So those are like two examples off the top of my head where human intervention is like totally necessary. But you can still automate the generation. You can still automate like the suggestion of like how you need to categorize things on a shelf, but someone still has to do it.
Yeah, that's true. Did you ever automate a process and then find out that, oh, maybe there needs to be some kind of checks and balances and it can't be 100% automated?
um, Yeah, I can give you a good example. It feels a little bit less in the data space, but it's something we explored at Shipyard, and something I'm still very bullish about in the like engineering space in general. We tried building out a system that we were calling words to workflows, which was the idea that you can provide a natural language prompt, and it would be able to generate the entire workflow on your behalf. Because we were finding that these generative AI models were getting very good at like writing code. But we kind of had this bad fallacy that we could give it one thing and it would just create this amazing final output. What we instead kind of came around to was the idea of building step by step to where you can say, hey, here is this CSV file. Here is how I want the data to be transformed. And then look at the output and say, oh, well, that's not quite right. Can you change it to do this thing? And so you go back and forth until finally you can verify, yes, this looks like I want it to. Now, can you give me a finalized script that takes it from the original input I gave you all the way to this final output that I verified, and then plug that into a workflow? And so for something like that, yeah, we realized that the whole thing couldn't necessarily just be a one and done automated script. It actually required someone to kind of fact check something continuously to make sure that it was building out like a deterministic solution that they wanted to actually see. Um, But at that point, once you implement it, then you don't necessarily need the human intervention. But you had to get there initially to get like the code and deploy that workflow as you wanted to. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. The difference that we saw there in our own experimentation.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I like that you pointed out how you have to kind of review that output and check to see whether or not it was what you were expecting. A lot of times you'll build out like a huge query and you'll miss some comma or whatever somewhere and it kind of mushes things together and the output
Yeah.
completely is wrong. But unless you don't actually go and review all of it, you might not notice that it is incorrect.
Yeah, there's another shift in the analytics space that's kind of interesting to me. The holy grail I think a lot of people have right now is like, could I just throw one of these generative AI models at my data sets and have business users ask it questions? The answer is, yeah, sure you could, but it might be inaccurate a good portion of the time. And do you want to really rely on these answers? I could genuinely see a pipeline system where rather than the business users making a request and a ticket of the data team to do all the work, they instead ask the question to this system. It generates the result, but they can't see it until a data person has like approved, yes, that SQL looks correct, yes, that answer makes sense based on what we know about the data, and then it gets sent over, which is still requiring some sort of like human in the loop, but it's still much faster than having the data analysts spend 24 hours or more digging into the data, trying to find the answer. Might be a little bit more boring of work to do as a analyst, but it's still requiring the extra like checks, and it's no different than like doing a pull request review as an engineer to make sure that your code is correct. It's just kind of like transitioning what the role of an analyst could be while someone else is asking the questions of the business.
Absolutely. That reminds me, I was on a team and we had quality assurance analysts. I think that's what we were calling them. And they did that same thing where they actually just were reviewing the code and making sure that it was performing what it needed to perform to get those outputs. And they did those checks and balances. And then we ran that through the automation pipeline and then spit out, whatever dashboard that was facing the end user.
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like self-service, but like on steroids.
Yeah, that's the end goal, man. From a lot of what I find, business users know what they want, but don't know how to get it. Data teams don't always know the business stuff, but there's like that missing middle layer of like communication. Or I've heard some people be like a data translator that is translating the request from the business people into something that the more technical data people can do. But I think that's just where things are starting to kind of go in the AI space. And so I'm interested to see how it helps out there.
I agree. That's a really good perspective. So you mentioned a lot of all of this automation and whatnot involves a lot of like strategic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is the perfect time to kind of transition into our fun bits section.
Sure.
Hey, nerd, are you looking for a career in data? I would absolutely love to help you out. I just launched a data career strategy program that helps folks break into data without breaking anything. I provided a link in the show notes if you want to learn more information about it. Now, back to the fun bits. So, strategic thinking, I feel you learn at a young age when you're playing games. Specifically, we're going to talk about board games since you just came back from the World Series of board gaming.
Yep, I did.
Can you tell us about that event? How did it go? Did you win? How much did you win?
So I did not win. We'll just start with that. But it was a great time. So for listeners out there, the World Series of Board Games, it was in its third year. Basically, the idea is that there's 16 games. You sign up for 4 of them to compete in. And if you win any of them, those top 16 people face off against each other. And then the winner of those 4 tables ends up competing in a final game. And so I did fairly well at my first game, Great Western Trail. I got into the finals and I got 4th. I got into the semifinals for Brass Birmingham, which was my second game. and then after that, I didn't do anything that's worth talking about. But it was still a very good time. And like, I've been into the board gaming hobby for, I don't know, probably over 10 years now. And I totally agree that it's something that really encourages like a high level of strategic thinking. But like within the confines of a specific system, you have these rules that have been provided to you, and within those rules and like the count of the pieces that you have and the number of turns you have, like how can you like most efficiently get the most points or take down an opponent or anything else like that. And so you're just constantly on your toes trying to think of like a new way to potentially win. And it encourages experimentation too, right? Like you're like, oh, they beat me with this. Can I do the same? Like what happens if I change this little component? And it's a easy way to do that in like a small low stakes perspective. I guess it's less of low stakes when you're at the World Series, but you know.
Absolutely. Did you know every single board game that they had, or was it known what board games you were
Yeah.
going to be provided? Okay.
Yeah, so they let you know beforehand what the 16 games were, and you knew the 4 that you signed up to compete in. So I was very confident on those. If I got any further, I was not going to be super confident. And I'll be honest, talking with the people there, a lot of them were like, yeah, I'm really good at half of them. And if this other half gets called, it's going to be terrible. So like whenever they revealed what the game was for the like semifinals for the last 16 people, if they didn't know the game, some of those people were like staying up until like 3 or 4 a.m. with people like helping them like say, hey, this card is really good, this one isn't, here's what you need to watch for, and trying to provide that strategy that they could quickly iterate on and implement for their match.
Okay, so before each of the events, you had time to kind of practice. Is that
Yeah, you had a little bit.
okay?
It just depended. It was like an all day thing if you got all the way to the finals. So like for my first day, I started games at 10 and I ended games at 11 p.m. I had little breaks in between for like go grab food and come right back. But yeah, it just depended on how well you did each day.
Okay. What games did you play?
So the Great Western Trail, Brass Birmingham, I played Azul, and I also played Castles of Burgundy. So 3 of those I felt really good about. Azul, I feel like it's a more popular one. You can find it in Target. Some people have played it. I'm terrible at that game. I tried so hard the week before. I kept losing to my in-laws, to my parents, to everyone online. I was like, it's not going to go well. It's
Yeah, I realized that I am not familiar with a lot of board games. I just
yeah,
know Settlers of Catan, which I
that's what a
actually
lot
just
of people
found
know.
out that they renamed to Catan.
Catan by
Um,
itself, yeah.
yeah, I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. And then I went and looked in my gaming cabinet, and I only have Munchkin, if
Mhm.
that's even considered a board game, but I have not played it yet.
Yeah.
So yeah, I am out of the board game. I play a lot of card games.
Yeah.
Actually, what's considered a board game, I think, is a game that we just bought called Abduction.
I don't know if I've heard of that.
So there's a UFO and it's full of a whole bunch of ducks, and you have these little cards, and you have to strategically place the ducks in a correct format to get points.
Got it.
So a little bit of strategic logic game. I don't know if it's a board game or a card game.
Any game is with they're all board games, right? Like there's no
Okay.
like real classification. But it is fun. Like in the 10 years since I kind of started the hobby, it has just exploded. There's so many different games out there and so many new things to try that like I just think it's fun. Like I run a weekly board game event in the Austin area. Just letting people try new things continuously, and I like really like giving people more experiences than the standards that a lot of people know, like Monopoly or Risk or like Yahtzee, like anything. If they like one of those games, is like, okay, well, let's try this. Like, how does this feel to you? And it's cool to see people like light up and continue to come back and enjoy just trying the new experiences.
That's awesome. Where do you host it? Like what venue?
I do it at a local brewery called Pint House Brewing. So it's a nice venue. Get food, get drinks while you're there. But it's a nice laid back environment for people to just kind of unwind in.
I love that. That's a good venue to have one of those at. I was
Yeah,
thinking either a brewery or a comic book shop.
yeah. Man, the scene here in Austin is crazy. I would say there's probably like 6 or 7 different like board game events that happen on a weekly basis. Any day of the week, you can find something, and so I know a lot of the folks in the area, but it's definitely cool down here.
That's awesome. What is your favorite board game?
My favorite is I always have 3.
Okay.
Is Terra Mystica, Pipeline, which my finger is up in front of here, and then a game called Food Chain Magnate. And those are going to be obscure for a lot of people, but for me, like the games that I like the most have a lot of player interaction to where I have to react to what someone is doing. So like Food Chain Magnate is literally a game about trying to run a fast food empire. You are each competing fast food chains, and people need to be marketed goods like pizza or burgers or soda for them to want it. And then you have to be the cheapest or the closest option for them to be able to buy it out. So, like, part of the game is just like advertising something over here where your neighboring brand can't actually fulfill the demand, or all of a sudden lowering your prices a whole lot so that they don't give anything to your opponent and they come to you. But you're like hiring employees, building up a base there. It sounds obvious why I'd like that given my
Absolutely. I'm like, that sounds so business related.
it is. It's fun though.
That's awesome. I have a video game where it's food related, but we're like building, we're like
Mhm.
cooking and whatnot. So I
Overcooked.
yes.
Yeah, okay. So quite a bit in the video game scene too, so yeah,
Yes. That
it's a
one
good
gets
one.
intense, especially when the floors start moving
Oh
and then
yeah,
you just like fall
communication is
off.
terrible in that game. You're like yelling at each other to get the right thing, yeah.
Or like how to make
uh,
some of those recipes are way bizarre. Like too
yeah.
many steps involved. You're like chucking noodles over to each other and you're like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, that one's a good time.
Yeah, I like that one. What would you say is a really good board game if you're in the data space?
Mm. Um Man, that is hard to say as like a introductory game. I'm trying to think of something that is like more numbers related, or maybe like a little bit of economy. So two games that came into my head immediately. One is called Power Grid. It is all about trying to build out cities and being able to power them, but you have to like pay for the link networks, and you're having to bid for those power plants. So you're having to kind of like think about like, is it worth paying this based on the supply and demand of buying these goods? That's one that came to my head. Another one is Modern Art, which is like it's an auction game where you're trying to buy and sell the most valuable art, but the amount that it's worth changes based on how many actually come to auction. And so it's an interesting one where you're having to it's kind of weird where you don't necessarily win the game by having the most art. Sometimes you win by just selling the most valuable art continuously and getting other people to give you money. So I'll say those 2 games just so I don't go down a rabbit hole, but I'd say like something that makes you think about the numbers and like, what should this really be valued at? And like, what's the probability of this getting to its highest value? Those are things that maybe data people might end up enjoying.
All right. I like that.
They're both good intro games. Then nothing too heavy there, but
Yeah, it
uh,
sounds like
yeah.
it. So, one question that I ask all my guests is about their learning styles.
Mhm.
So, if you are learning anything that is brand new to you, what is your go to approach for learning that new thing?
I like just diving in. That's really like the thing that makes it click the most for me, and so like a good recent example, if any of you are on X or Twitter, I'm sure you've seen the threads about using wow, I can't remember the name of it. Right there we go, Cursor, Cursor with the new Anthropic model for like writing code and doing stuff like that. I'm like, okay, how cool could it actually be? And so like I watched maybe like a 30-minute video of someone like showing how they used it, but really just trying to use it myself, figure out the ins and outs, try like a new thought process. So like one thing that I thought was interesting, when you're using Cursor with AI, a lot of it is prompting and saying like, hey, I want this to be changed, so let's say so it has a green background, or so that it adds like tags to the page, and it'll give you back the code and you can click apply, and it just adds it directly in there. But like once you get into it, you're like, okay, well, this is kind of cumbersome. Every single time that I want to do something, I have to click apply. I mean, cumbersome. I didn't have to write any code, right? But it's still annoying. So like I go online and figure out, okay, is there a way to be able to solve that? And then I find out some people are using it by like writing a product description of the exact thing that they want to see from the very beginning, and it just generates all the code rather than having to do it like a feature at a time. And I'm like, okay, this is way different than what I was trying to do. And so I just by digging in and like trying it on my own and figuring out what I get frustrated by, what I like, what I don't like, it gives me like new pathways to explore down and to try and figure out stuff. That's generally what ends up working best for me. But I know for some people that's scary. But I just like being able to get hands on and have kind of like a high level knowledge of how something works in order to feel comfortable with it.
Yeah. How do you come up with use cases if it's something that's completely new and you have no idea what it even does? How do you even approach it?
That's a good question. It's something that I genuinely I have not been able to figure out myself, because I find that like a lot of ideas just come to me naturally. I actually like have a notebook full of writing ideas, board game ideas, business ideas, like all those things. I just have them. I need to write them down, and maybe eventually I'll do something with them, but I don't. But I don't know what the root is of like what caused me to like have ideas or things to experiment with in the first place. I think that it probably just comes from having like a diverse exposure to new things. And sometimes like you hear people say go on a walk and you'll come back with like more ideas than you had, or like it clears your head and all of a sudden you figure out how to solve a problem. um the brain is a weird, mysterious thing. And so I think sometimes like you just have to try something, and if you don't have like a specific idea, it's being open to a new exposure or a new thing that might eventually spark an idea. But I wouldn't like be mad at myself for not having the right ideas. But I think sometimes people like discount what their ideas might be. Like they're not good enough, they're not advanced enough, they're not like interesting enough to dive into. And I think that does a disservice as well. Like I write down every idea from least good to to best, and figure out how I might be able to apply them over time. Hopefully that answers your question, but I think that's a complex question that I don't really know if I have a perfect answer to.
That was perfect. Yeah, I thought it was.
Okay, great.
So, do you have one of those like bedside notebooks? Do you wake up in the middle of the night with ideas as well?
I don't. Thankfully, I fall asleep in like 5 minutes and I stay asleep, which
Oh,
is just
jealous.
it's basically a superpower. I found out, right? That is not the experience most people have. No, I have two things. One, I use Obsidian, which is just a note-taking app that stores everything in Markdown and it syncs it across devices. I use that because it's kind of future-proof. Markdown and text files aren't going to go anywhere in the next 40 years because they haven't gone away in the last 40 years.
Yeah.
But also I have like a remarkable notebook that I like keep track of everything, and I write like experiences. So like a good example is like whenever I go like travel or do a new experience like this World Series of board games, I try to make sure that I sit down and reflect on like all the thoughts I had, like new experiences, what occurred to me while I was doing that, because literally just having record of it somewhere means that I might be able to refer back to it eventually. And I kind of started that habit just because my memory is terrible. I remember systems really, really well. I don't remember like things that happened in my life very well. And so like I have to write them down and reflect on it so that I can hopefully be able to capture what sparked intrigue for me in that moment. That might not matter then, but it might matter 2 5 years later, that I can look back on.
Yeah, that's great. I also started doing that as well. And I just, because you're so emotional and you just want to jot everything down,
Yeah.
you're inspired and all of that, and just getting that out of your head and onto, whatever form of stuff that you have available is a really good practice. What I still struggle with, and I don't know if you actually go back and read what you wrote.
Not always. I
Okay.
occasionally. So like a fun exercise that my wife and I did for like a recent trip, because she decided to do the same thing. I very much wrote my notes like a guy would. It was a bunch of bullets of like facts and figures of what happened, and she like did a whole storytelling thing. And so we like captured the same events, but with very like two very different perspectives, which was kind of like cool to see there. So occasionally I look back, but no, I'm not as good as I would like to be about revisiting those notes, which I think is
Mhm.
also important because you never know what's going to spark something for you years down the road.
Absolutely, I agree. I know I need to go back and revisit them. For that instance you just mentioned, did y'all swap and read each other's to kind of see their POV?
We just read them out loud
Oh,
to each
okay.
other, and then
Same.
had like the experience. Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So, for any folks out there that are interested in getting into the data space, do you have any recommendations for them?
Yeah, this one might be a little bit controversial, but I don't feel like just going into like a data engineering boot camp or data science boot camp or something like that is like the right path. I What I find is that people that have done those boot camps or done that for their master's program or something else like that, if they don't have like the industry experience, or if they don't have like intimate knowledge about how to solve a very specific problem, they end up just like parroting back like the technology to use, the like scripts to write, the models to implement, and they're not so much focused on like problems. And I would encourage you, if you're trying to get into the data space, like if you have existing experience, try and figure out in the work that you're doing right now, how could you implement data into that work? What problems are you having that if you had the right data you might be able to solve, or like implement some sort of automated system? And I think just changing that perspective, that's really what we're missing in the space right now. It's a lot of people to have a tangible problem that they want to solve with data. And if you can work towards developing more technical skills to solve that problem, I think not only do you make yourself a more invaluable asset to an organization, but you also become a better like prospective employee for other companies, because you're thinking about problems rather than thinking about technical implementations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Great advice.
Yeah.
Do you have any other final words of encouragement for the listeners out there?
I'm going to mirror some of those statements there, even for like people that are currently in the data field. Spend more time with the business users. Spend more time trying to understand what their day to day looks like. Shadowing is super fun and super eye opening. Like back when I ran a team, I had to have my team spend 50% of their time like implementing ads, and then 50% of their time doing data work, because I needed them to get frustrated and I needed them to see what the problems were so that they would actually go and make a change. And I think sometimes technical people, data people, they're scared of doing the business stuff. but man, it can do wonders for like opening up new opportunities, more interesting things for you to work on than just like saying, hey, someone saying, hey, I need access to this data, and you figuring out how to get it for them. Like, no, now you might have like an actual problem that you wanted to solve that you found from watching Jim, and now from watching them, you're like building out this entire system, and it's more intrinsically motivated rather than just being given a ticket. So yeah, spend the time with the business users, spend time trying to understand how things actually work, do a little bit of shadowing, and I think that can work wonders in terms of how effective you actually are as a data practitioner.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so very much, Blake, again for coming on the show. If any of the audience members have any questions for you, where can they find and or follow you?
Yeah, feel free to find me on LinkedIn or X. Should be easy to find Blake Burch. You can also just go to blakeburch.com. That's my main website. It'll have links to everything there.
Thank you. And as always, folks, happy learning.
Thanks.